In this video, I'd like to give you a general overview of using Unity's UI system to build user interfaces, menus, and heads-up displays inside of your games. Unity's UI system is pretty powerful as well as pretty simple to build. Part of the idea behind it is, as developers, we should be able to build menus relatively quickly because it's something that every single game has. So they've developed this system with a quick iteration and ease of use in mind. Here's an example menu that I'm looking at here. So this is the title screen for an example game. So you can see I have this 3D scene in the background, and then overlaid on top of it is this 2D menu. This menu has some animated components in it. It has 3 buttons here: start, options, and exit game. When I hover my mouse over the buttons, they change to have a highlight. There's also an indicator light to the right side of it, which spins. I can click on these buttons, and it changes the entire menu I'm looking at. There's scrolling windows inside of it. If I go to the controls, I can scroll through this panel up and down. There's also sliders. There's back buttons so I can go back, an exit game button, as well as a start button. And if I hit start, it'll load the first scene of this game. Let's take a look at how this user interface is actually built and some of the general concepts behind building UI. Let's take a look in the scene view. So if you remember, in my game view, there's this critter here, and here's this sort of mossy rock and this planet up here, right? So this is my 3D scene that has that critter, the mossy rock. If I go down here, I can kind of see that planet up there. My main camera is right here. And you may notice that something's missing, my user interface. Well, the reason why is because my user interface is actually way up here. And this is something that you just kind of need to get used to. When you're building overlays that sort of overlay over your entire game, they take up the same size as your game window takes up. So if your game window is 1920 by 1080, if that's your screen resolution and that's what you're aiming for, then they're going to take up 1980 units wide on your, like in your Unity scene. So they're going to seem fairly big. The object here that's containing all of these is this start menu canvas. So every single user interface built using Unity's UI is built off of this canvas object. So a canvas object, you can tell it's a canvas because it has this canvas component on it. And then everything underneath this canvas component is going to be rendered in that user interface window. So there's one canvas for this entire main menu that we're looking at here. Now, underneath the canvas, everything in a user interface is built using regular game objects. You're probably familiar with the hierarchies that Unity has, any kind of game objects childed underneath them. Well, everything inside the user interface is childed underneath this canvas object in some manner. So you can see there's this menu background object. If I move it around, it's essentially the entire thing, everything we're looking at. Underneath the menu background, there's the start logo, which is this object here, which I'm moving around right now. There's the start button, which is this object here, right? And within the start button, there's even the text, as well as an indicator. And the indicator is, if you remember, this spinning triangle, right? This thing gets sort of enabled and disabled, as needed. So a couple things to note. One is that everything in Unity's user interface is under a canvas object. It's built using normal game objects. In addition to the canvas component and the canvas game object, there's also objects that represent just straight images. So there's this menu background, which I said was a parent for essentially everything, our entire menu here. But on this menu background object, there is an image component. And this image component is this background that I'm toggling on and off right now. So there's a 2D image there. The start logo is its own image. It also has this animator component attached to it. That's how you get that animated flashing. The start button is its own component, right? Or its own game object with a button component attached to it. It has an image, which is the visuals of what this button looks like, but then it also has a button component. The button component, which I'll go into in more detail later, does all the functionality for hovering your mouse over this button, clicking on the button, and what should happen as responses when those things happen. There are text elements. So these are game objects that have a text component on them. This menu is built using Text Mesh Pro. There's 2 types of text that you can use in Unity. There's the default text component, but then there's also one called Text Mesh Pro. Text Mesh Pro is an alternative, and it makes your text look a little bit crisper and cleaner. So it's recommended to use, especially if you're doing something like virtual reality. Text Mesh Pro is definitely a way to go. For a lot of projects, though, using the regular text component can be relatively straightforward, and you can also get good looking text that way. So the things to know so far. Everything in our canvas is built using regular game objects. Everything's built using this hierarchy, right? A lot of the functionality that we're looking for are built into these components on these game objects. Where can you find these components? Well, if you right click and you say 3D object, or I'm sorry, you go to UI, you can see all these different components. The text component as well as the Text Mesh Pro. There's an image component, the button component, sliders, toggles, scroll bars, drop downs, input fields. If you have something where a player needs to enter their name or enter a username and password, those would be input fields where players can type them in. The base canvas component itself, as well as panels, scroll views, and event systems. So that's sort of this big picture on how user interface is built. A couple other nice things that you should know is when working with UI like this, a couple best practices. One is it's really easy to select this canvas, hover your mouse over here, and then hit F to focus on it. And one of the things that is tough is that you're always kind of looking at it from an angle. Well, if you use this tool here, right, which is sort of like the 2D UI tool, is what it's intended for, and then you also select this 2D mode, which does this, it lines your user interface squared up with your scene view camera. This is the easiest way to edit your user interface. So I can click on objects here and I'm looking at them straight on. I can grab the corners and edges of these things, move them around, shift them and scale them exactly how I want them to be. So there's sort of the fundamentals on how a canvas is built, how a user interface is built, as well as the best practices on how to work with them.